Hi, this is Mr. Payton. Welcome to the Science of Everything, Episode 7. In this episode, I'd like to talk about an old structure, something that I learned about back in the late 90s. But really, in all of my readings and all of my research and all the things that I've done over the years, I haven't found anything that's really much better or more valuable than this structure, and that's Bloom's taxonomy. Bloom's taxonomy is a structure that levels or gives a hierarchy to different ways of learning and learning outcomes. So it's pretty systematic, it's not very complicated at all, and I think for that reason some people have decided that it doesn't have as much validity. But for me, it's essential to the way that I create lessons and try to keep my class interested and engaged. So I'll take you through them and then I'll try to apply it in an example. The first level is what's called remembering. And we all know what that means. It means to recall something. And so that's one of the most basic things. If you're dealing with a little person, someone who's just learning, someone who's a toddler age, you show them things and the hope is that they can remember, they can recall it again. So if you say this is letter A, you hope that the next day when you show them letter A, they understand what that means and they can find it again. After you teach someone how to remember things or recall, and that can take years in some cases, or it's a skill that you just keep coming back to, you would move into understanding. If you think about how little kids use words, for example, they may say, well, I see a cat. And the question you may ask them, well, then what is a cat? And they could explain to you what a cat is. So that tells you a different level of understanding. It's not just that they recall that that animal is called a cat. They can now give you some information about that cat. Moving on from remembering and understanding, we have application. In my experience, most good teachers or good instructors, coaches, this is where most of them live in terms of their skill sets, how they practice, those kinds of things, is application. That's trying to take that information and use it in new situations. So now that I have the word cat, I can apply that to the family of cats and talk about how there is a cat family. So now there are tigers and bobcats and lions and cheetahs and things like this. So this is now taking that word and in some ways enhance that definition to have a broader understanding. Now we start getting into the second half of Bloom's taxonomy. So there's 6 levels altogether. We've covered the first 3. In the next 3, you really get into some higher functions. After remembering, understanding, and applying, we get analyzing. You hear this term all the time, and people get paid great sums of money to analyze. That's where we take the information we have after we put it into new situations and we can make connections to things. So we're looking at a body of information, we're looking at data, maybe we're using some terms that we've used before, and we're trying to figure out how can we connect that to some other learning, or possibly something in the past, or just connect it to a new concept. But that's a fairly difficult thing to do because it requires a great deal of skills to do that. So you have to recall, you have to understand, you have to apply. And now you're going to try to make a connection between this learning that you have and possibly something new or something completely different. Once we get past making connections, now it's time for justification. And that stage is called evaluation. In the evaluation level of Bloom's taxonomy, we're now trying to prove why what we know has value or validity. And that's where a lot of people who get into more complicated jobs and positions are able to show their intelligence and their skill set because they are able to take those connections, those applications, and now give you reasons and rationales as to why there's any value or validity to what it is that's going on. Finally, one of my favorites is creation, where you have to produce some model, some document, or produce a situation that demonstrates all these other levels of learning. So you might wonder, so what does that have to do with my class? In the science of everything, I deal with social science, which is commonly known as history or social studies, and I deal with natural science. For me, I generally start every lesson with some type of vocabulary. I make sure that we have a sound understanding of the concepts, and then I begin going through these processes. I start to explain what's happening. I start to use the terms in different situations. And then this is where I turn it over to my students. I turn it over to my class. And they start to make those connections. Oh, that makes sense because that reminds me of this. Oh, I saw something like that in a movie or in one of the games that they played. Once we get past that, we have a couple of structures that we use. One is a debating structure we use that really focuses the students on rhetoric. And then in our natural science, we use the engineering design process to give them an opportunity to justify what they're doing. And the way they justify is by listing the steps, listing the reasons, going back and being willing to find things to improve or add on to their process. And then finally, as we get through the justification, once we finish a larger unit or a larger concept, I will generally ask them to produce something now, whether that's a document, a model, create an opportunity to share with the class. And that's where you really start to see some of the magic happen. And so throughout this process, what will happen is the questions will come up, and based on the kind of questions that students ask, I can identify where in Bloom's taxonomy those questions are coming from. And so that gives me a lot of information about where their misconceptions may be, or just where they're just trying to get clarification. And so again, this is not something that's brand new. It may not seem to be cutting edge, but in my opinion, it is extremely successful in giving me a great framework and giving my students an opportunity to find ways to continue to push their levels of understanding. Thank you for watching this episode of The Science of Everything. Have a great weekend.